Today in Final Fantasy, we get some super strong lands, some sneaky demon support, a card that'll let you tap literally any permanent for mana, and so much more. Let's break them down. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Final Fantasy spoilers. So we're at day 2 of spoiler season, and honestly, day 2 of spoiler season, one of my favorite spoiler season days. Day 1 is always fun, but there's so many cards that it kind of feels like we can't do any of them justice and really talk about any individual card that much. But today things have calmed down a little bit, not as overwhelming as yesterday, but we still have some really cool cards to talk about, which means we should probably jump right into it. Start talking sweet new Final Fantasy cards. Before we do, a couple of quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can pre-order them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest previews throughout the day, you should head on over to MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk some Final Fantasy. First up today, we get a land that I think is going to be pretty important in Standard once we get to rotation in a couple of months, and that is Starting Town. So Starting Town, it is a town. That's a new land type. We didn't really get into it yesterday because we had so many spoilers to get through, but towns are kind of like gates or whatever. So far, we haven't seen any payoffs for towns, but I expect we'll probably get some town payoff at some point in the future, but not really relevant to this card. This card is just a good standalone land. So Starting Town enters tapped unless it's your first, second, or third turn of the game. So essentially a fast land. It taps to make a generic mana, or you can pay 1 life and tap it to make a mana of any color. So this is kind of like a City of Brass or a Mana Confluence. The upside is you can choose to tap it for generic mana, which is going to be relevant later in the game. This is a land that on turn 1, on turn 2 gives you the colors that you need, and then later in the game, hopefully you can tap it for generic and stop taking damage off of it, which kind of makes it like a Spire of Industry effect almost. So why is this card going to be so important in Standard after rotation? And the answer is, we are losing a lot of our untapped dual lands. If you look at the cards that are rotating, we're losing all the pain lands, and we're losing half of the fast lands. The one from Outlaws of Thunder Junction still stick around, but the other half of the cycle is rotating, which means right now, let's say you're playing like an Azorius aggro deck, you're not going to have Adhikar Waste, you're not going to have Seacrobe Ghost, you're kind of left with a Verge, which is kind of inconsistent early in the game. You still have the Surveil lands, but they're going to come into play tap the Scrying lands. So essentially, all of the untapped dual lands are leaving some of these color combinations, and I expect that Starting Town is going to be one of the most important lands for 2 and 3 color aggro decks, just because we're not going to have any other options. And this might not last forever. I expect over the next year of Standard, we'll get more dual lands printed in the format, and the importance of Starting Town will probably wane, or maybe it'll still be important in like 5 color decks or whatever. But over the short term, like this summer, I would not be surprised to see Starting Town is like a 4 of land in a lot of aggro decks in Standard. It gets a little bit better if you're in a Outlaws of Thunder Junction fast land color combination, but even if you're playing Golgari and you still have Blooming Marsh, you're still losing the pain land. You're still going to want more than 2 dual lands in your deck or whatever. So I think we're going to be seeing this card everywhere in Standard pretty much as soon as rotation hits this summer. I also think it could have some relevance in older formats. So if you look at like Mana Confluence, definitely not a staple land. Having to take a damage every time you tap it is actually very painful, especially in formats where aggro is popular. That's like every format these days. So I think if you're playing, let's say like Pioneer Greasefang, you usually play like 1 Mana Confluence. I think that Starting Town might just be better. So obviously, the downside is in the late game, it's going to come into play tapped. Mana Confluence always going to come into play untapped. But I think that the upside of Starting Town, being able to tap it for a generic mana and not lose life, might be enough of an upside, especially in a format like Pioneer. If you think about Greasefang, do you really care if your 4th or 5th or 6th land is coming into play tapped? Probably not that much, as long as it's coming into play untapped early in the game. That's really doing what you want it to do. And then the upside of being able to be like, all right, I'll tap it for a generic mana, use my other lands to make colored mana, and not take any damage is actually super, super huge. So I think Starting Town, the lands are really good. definitely going to see a ton of standard play after rotation, and you can play it pre-rotation too if you want to, just to have another untapped dual land. But I think after rotation in specific, this card's going to be really essential to standard, and it probably has some fringe upside in formats like Pioneer too. We also got a new Saga creature in Summon Leviathan. So Summon Leviathan, 6 mana for a 6/6 ward 2. First lore counter, return each creature that isn't a Kraken, Leviathan, Merfolk, Octopus, or Serpent to its owner's hand. And then the last 2 lore counters. Until end of turn, whenever you attack with a Kraken, Leviathan, Merfolk, Octopus, or Serpent, draw a card. So Summon Leviathan is pretty interesting. These Saga creatures really intrigue me. I haven't been able to really wrap my head around just how good they're going to be. So when you think about this card, you play it for 6 mana, you bounce everything, but it's summoning sick that turn, so you can't attack with it. So essentially you get a big 6/6 blocker and probably bounce all your opponent's stuff. The next turn, you trigger the second ability. So when it attacks, you're going to get to draw a card. But that's the only turn that you get to attack with it, so it's only ever going to hit for 6 damage at the most, and then the next turn you get the ability again, but it's going to go away. So is this card actually going to be good? And the answer is, I really have no idea. We have seen similar cards in the past, Whelming Wave, Slimvada. They've mostly been casual cards that we see in commander decks, like sea creature commander decks. They haven't really been standard staples, so I expect the same might be true of Summon Leviathan. On the other hand, this is only 6 mana. Slimvada, you had to cast 10 mana if you want to actually kick it and bounce everything. So it's way cheaper, and you get that big 6/6 for a couple of turns, and maybe draw some cards. I think maybe the most interesting part about this card is it adds Merfolk to the list of creatures that it cares about. In the past with sea creature cards, we've never had Merfolk on there. It's always been Krakens, Leviathans, Octopuses, and Serpents. So adding Merfolk to the mix actually opens up a bunch more decks when you can play this. So in Standard, we have a ton of good Merfolk. We haven't really seen Merfolk be a real deck, and even if there was a Merfolk deck, I don't know if you want a 6-drop in it. It seems kind of expensive, but I could certainly imagine a world where you just make a big board of random janky Merfolk, then you summon Leviathan, bounce all your opponent's stuff, your Merfolk stick around, Alpha Strike, win the game. Even if you don't win the game, if you make a bunch of Merfolk, you can draw a ton of cards off this with the second and third lore counter, because remember, it's whenever a Kraken, Leviathan, Merfolk, Octopus, or Serpent attacks. So if you have 5 Merfolk on the battlefield and attack with them each, you're going to draw 5 cards. So even if it's a temporary effect, you might just get so much value out of it that it's going to be worth it. Where I think we'll see this card sign for sure is going to be in Commander decks. In Commander, people love bouncing all their opponent's stuff. Some of the most powerful wraths in the entire format are wraths that leave your board unchecked while your opponent loses all their stuff. And Summon Leviathan in the right deck, in the sea creature deck or in a Merfolk deck, is going to get that done. You just make your opponent pick up all their defenses and you have your team to swing in and hopefully win the game. So if you're playing a Merfolk deck or a sea creature deck like Kiora or Koma or Runo, Stormkirk, I think this is a super easy addition to the deck. It's almost like in one of your removal spots, but it also happens to be a creature because of the Saga creature thing, so you get the extra synergies from its creature type as well. So I think that Summon Leviathan seems like a really solid commander card in Merfolk and in sea creature decks, and it could have some standard relevance. We also got our new blue adventure land, and it's a pretty good one, Jidoor Aristocratic Capital. So this is a land, comes into play tapped, adds a blue mana, but it's also a sorcery in Overture, which is 6 mana to make target opponent mill half of their library rounded down. So this is essentially a land that's also traumatized for 1 more mana. The only downside I see with Jidoor, you can't target yourself, and occasionally with traumatize, if you're a self-mill deck, you want to use it on yourself to mill a ton of your cards. You can't do that with Jidoor, but I think that's fine. I'm actually pretty excited for this card because we have a lot of pieces to make a mill deck work in Standard. We haven't really seen dedicated mill be a thing. We've seen control decks that win by milling thanks to Jace, but if you think of the cards we have in Standard, Jace the Perfected Mind, absurdly strong mill spell. River Churn Monument kind of combos with these cards since you get to mill with its exhaust mode equal to the cards already in someone's graveyard. So if you can Jidoor, make your opponent mill half their library, and then River Churn Monument exhaust, make him mill the other half, you pretty much win the game on the spot. Plus we have extra stuff, Glacierwood Siege, the Mind Skinner, Founding the Third Path, Theresian Mindbreaker. So I think if some sort of mill deck develops in Standard, it's very likely that Jidoor, easy 4 of in that deck. So mono blue mill, maybe Simic Mill, maybe Dimir. I'm not sure the color combination yet, but Mill is at the top of my list for decks to build in our new standard format, and this land is a big reason why. It's also really good in Commander Mill decks. Probably the best home, Burvac. Burvac, if you would mill one or more cards of your opponents, they mill twice as many instead. So if you have Jidoor and you cast the Traumatize mode, you mill half, but then you double that up. Half times half is going to be all, so you just win the game on the spot. Well, I guess you don't win the game in Commander, but you kill someone on the spot by making them mill all their cards. So that seems pretty powerful. Plus, as a land, you have extra ways of finding this. You don't need a mystical tutor or whatever. You can expedition map this into your hand and then combo off with Burvac and get your opponent that way. It also seems good in pretty much any mill deck. Like I said before, it doesn't work in self-mill. So if your goal is to mill yourself, then you probably don't want to play this card. I will also say in Commander, if you're not a mill deck, milling half of your opponent's deck is a bad thing. You don't really want to mill half your opponent's deck because the graveyard is almost like another hand in some ways, where a lot of decks are going to have some sort of synergy to be able to get stuff out of their graveyard, take advantage of it. So you don't really want to just fire this off in a generic deck because you might actually be helping your opponent. But if you're a mill deck, Phoenix, Captain Nagathod, the Wise Mothman, this is going to be one of the best lands in your entire deck. So Jidoor, the card's great. I absolutely love these lands. They're essentially a new twist on MDFCs with the upside that thanks to adventures, they're MDFCs that you actually kind of get to use both modes of in some situation, which is something traditional MDFCs can't do. So Jidoor going to be really sweet for standard mill and easy inclusion in any mill deck in Commander. We also got a new black legend in Ardyn the Usurper. In Ardyn, it seems really strong, but it is also a lot of mana. It's 8 mana for a 4/4 legendary human noble. Says demons you control have menace and lifelink and haste, and then Star Scourge. At the beginning of combat on your turn, exile up to 1 target creature card from a graveyard. If you exile a card this way, create a token that's a copy of it, except it's a 5/5 demon, and then if you have Ardyn, that demon will have menace and lifelink and haste. So Ardyn, it reminds me the most of like a twist on the Scarab God. The Scarab God could exile things from the graveyard for 4 mana to make 4/4 zombie versions of them. Ardyn is kind of a twist on that. You don't have to spend any mana on it, which is huge, but you only can do it once per turn, and you get a 5/5 demon rather than a 4/4 zombie. But we saw the Scarab God be really, really good in the past, although part of that was the Scarab God was really annoying to kill, because if it dies, it keeps coming back from the graveyard to your hand, so it was hard to deal with forever. Ardyn doesn't really have that, and I do worry that the 8 mana investment up front might just be too much for it to really see standard play. But if you can get to 8 mana, this card's kind of busted. Like, you play it and you get a 4/4, immediately go to combat and get a 5/5 to go with the 4/4. The 5/5 is going to have menace and lifelink and haste, so you swing in and gain 5 life right away, and it can target your opponent's graveyard too, which is a nice little bonus. In some ways, it also reminds me of Whip of Erebos, thanks to the lifelink on the demons. We saw Whip of Erebos a long time ago actually be very powerful in standard, because you could reanimate something, your stuff would have lifelink, so you'd gain back a bunch of life. It was a good way to stabilize against aggro, and I think that Ardyn, to some extent, thanks to the lifelink, can do that as well. So if this sticks on the battlefield, it is going to take over the game, and it should take over the game. It's an 8-drop. You're putting a lot of mana into this, but there's also going to be times where you spend 8 mana on this, and your opponent just kills it even before you get to combat, and you don't get anything out of it. So I'm kind of not expecting this to be like a competitive standard card, but it would be really sweet if it was. It also kind of reminds me of Crocs and Kunros, where if you're playing a reanimation deck, and if you're playing Ardyn, you're probably going to be a reanimation deck. Spending 8 mana on this is just way too much for most decks, but if you can use like a Zombify or a Squirming Emergence to cheat it into play for 3 or 4 mana, then you're really in business with this card. But it kind of reminds me of Croxos and Kunros, where is a very good first reanimation target in a deck that wants to reanimate multiple things. You can like Zombify Ardyn, then go to combat, use Ardyn's ability to get back like an Atraxa or a Velgavoth as a 5/5 demon, and get this huge thing into play, and essentially have 2 things into play, and then you still have Ardyn for next turn to be able to get more value out of it. So maybe it can work in some sort of reanimation deck. Also worth mentioning, because of Unholy Annex Ritual Chamber, we do have reasons to play demons in standard. Unfortunately, Ardyn itself isn't a demon, which is kind of awkward with Unholy Annex, but we do have a reason to build like like a black demon deck in Standard. The other thing that's really, really interesting about this card is it's going to be a very popular demon commander just because somehow we've never really had a mono black demon commander. If you look at demons in Commander, Be'lakor, super popular in Grixis. There's a bunch of Rakdoses, which are in Rakdos, obviously. But if you look at mono black, the number one mono black demon commander is Taborax, which I guess makes sense since it is a demon. But if you read its text, it's all about clerics. It doesn't actually care about demons in any way. So this is the first mono black legend that actively, honestly cares about demons. So if you want to build demons, but you want to be monocolored, I think Ardyn's going to be your commander by default. Also, pretty cute Shadowborn Apostle commander. Shadowborn Apostle, you play as many as you want. They tutor out demons. So that seems super cute in an Ardyn deck as well. So I think Ardyn might be a little too expensive to really be great in Standard. Maybe it can be like a one-of in some sort of reanimation deck or something. But in Commander, seems like a super fun mono black demon commander, and I think it'll be pretty popular. We also got a spicy new green enchantment in a Realm Reborn. So a Realm Reborn, 6-mana enchantment, says other permanents you control have tap to add 1 mana of any color. Honestly, not sure why I had to say other permanents. I feel like it's a green card, it's 6 mana. If you could tap it to make a single mana, it probably would have been fine. But regardless, this card's still pretty interesting. So we have seen in the past quite a few cards that let all of your creatures tap for a mana of any color. We got Enduring Vitality in Standard right now. We've seen Cryptolith Rites, Elven Chorus. So we've seen a bunch of cards that are similar to a Realm Reborn and much cheaper than a Realm Reborn, but they only work with creatures. So if you just want to turn all your creatures into Birds of Paradise, there's just cheaper and easier ways to do this. The upside of a Realm Reborn is it turns all your permanents into a Birds of Paradise. Every single one of your lands becomes a pain-free City of Brass. Every one of your creatures becomes a Birds of Paradise. But where this gets really scary is once you start getting in the world of tokens, for example. Think about like a Lannis deck or a Samwise deck. You toss in an Academy Manufacturer, and these decks are really good at just spewing tons of foods and clues and treasures on the battlefield. Imagine that all of those are tapping to make a mana. You're going to have some of the most insane turns imaginable because all those are coming into play. You can immediately tap them. If they're not creatures, there's no summoning sickness or anything. So every token that you make with a Lannis and an Academy Manufacturer just immediately becomes more mana that you can use to cast more spells, to make more tokens, to make more mana. It seems very easy to just go functionally infinite if you get a Realm Reborn on the battlefield alongside a Lannis or a Samwise in some sort of token deck. So that's one of the possibilities of the card. The other way you can play this card that's pretty neat is in decks that put a lot of non-creature permanents on the battlefield. Like I said before, if you just want to turn all your creatures into Birds of Paradise, we got a bunch of ways of doing this. The unique part of a Realm Reborn is it works with any permanent. So think about like an Enchantress deck, for example. In Enchantress, you're playing a ton of permanents. That's kind of the whole gimmick of Enchantress. You want to trigger your Sethis or whatever. And you're playing a bunch of Wild Growths and Fertile Grounds for ramp. You're playing Sphere of Safety or Oblivion Rings for defense. If you get a Realm Reborn down, suddenly all these cards tap for mana, which seems really, really strong. Like when your Wild Growth isn't just making a land tap for more mana, but you can actually just tap the Wild Growth for a mana too, you're going to make so much mana. So any sort of like enchantment deck is probably the best home since it is an enchantment. There was even some artifact decks that are like that. If you're just spewing a ton of artifacts into play, having them all tap for mana is going to be really, really strong. So those are the kind of places that I'd be looking to play Realm Reborn. But if you want to be really mean, and I think this is the strongest thing you can do with the card, it kind of combos with Winter Orb and Static Orb. These old artifacts, back in the earliest days of Magic, they made these artifacts that only worked when they were untapped. Winter Orb, 2-mana artifact, says as long as it's untapped, players can't untap more than 1 land during their untap steps. One of the most brutal cards ever made in Magic. Static Orb, almost the same. You can only untap 2 permanents during your untap step as long as it's untapped. So the trick here is, if you get a Realm Reborn down alongside Winter Orb, and I assume this would be in Commander most likely, but you wait until the end step of the player before your turn, and then you're like, all right, I'll tap my Winter Orb to make a mana. You don't even got to spend the mana on anything. Just tap your Winter Orb to make a mana, and then when you go to your turn, the Winter Orb's going to be tapped. So that means you get to untap all your permanents, and then you leave the Winter Orb untapped when it goes through all of your opponent's turns. So your opponents are only going to get 1 mana per turn to work with. So you're going to have all your mana, and even more mana thanks to to Realm Reborn generating mana, and your opponents are essentially going to have no resources. So definitely a super mean way to play this card, but it does seem like one of the best new combo pieces for cards like Winter Orb and Static Orb if you want to get punched at your local commander game. It's also cute with things that just want to be tapped, like Magda, for example. When it becomes tapped, you make a treasure. Obviously, the problem with Magda is it's only a 2/1, so being able to get it tapped in combat can be kind of risky. But with a Realm Reborn, you just tap Magda to make a mana. It's also going to make a treasure token, so it kind of taps for 2 mana. Again, if you're just doing creature shenanigans, you can do this with Cryptolith Rites, but still, if you're playing a deck that wants Realm Reborn for other reasons, these effects like Magda do go up in value. It's also just super sweet with like Nyx Bloom Ancient, all of your permanents making 3 times as much mana. Amara is another one where Amara wants to be tapped to make tokens. Realm Reborn really good there. So there are a bunch of synergies for this card, and I gotta say, I just love the design of this card. It's 6 mana. I don't really think it'll see standard play, but it has a pretty unique effect where it lets you tap anything that needs to be tapped, and it makes a bunch of mana, and it has that weird combo potential with stuff like Winter Orb. So I think it's like a casual commander build around. I expect this card to actually be pretty popular. It does something we haven't seen before, and even at 6 mana, it's going to generate so much mana that in a lot of decks, I think it's going to be worth the cost. We also got another black legend in Zenos Galvus, which flips into Shinryu. So the front side of this card, 5 mana for a 4/4 legendary human noble warrior. Also, I'm sure I butchered this name, so apologies. Its ability is My First Friend, and it's when it enters, choose a creature an opponent controls until end of turn. Creatures other than it and the chosen creature get -2/-2, so kind of like an aggro wrath. And then it says, when the chosen creature leaves the battlefield, you transform it into Shinryu, which is an 8/8 flyer that as it enters, you choose an opponent, and when the chosen player loses the game, you win the game. So that last ability not going to be the most relevant in a 1v1 format like Standard. In Standard, if your opponent loses the game, you have already won the game. So obviously a card designed a little bit more for Commander, I would say, than for Standard. I'm actually curious what people think about a card like this. Personally, cards that don't function outside of Commander, I really don't like when they print them in Standard sets. I feel like this would be a perfect Commander precon card. Not sure why they had to put it in the main set, although I could see the argument that in Standard, maybe it's still good enough. Like, sure, you're not going to win the game when someone loses the game with Shinryu, but you're still getting an 8/8 flyer out of the deal. And I can imagine scenarios where you can get that 8/8 pretty quickly. So let's start with the bad news of this card. The bad news of this card, as far as Standard play, is we already have Harvester of Miseries, and in a lot of ways, Harvester of Mysteries just does everything Zenos does, and then some. Like, for 5 mana, you get the same enters, giving everything -2/-2. I guess Zenos lets your opponent keep 1 creature for some reason, but you can also discard it as an early game removal spell. It's got better stats, it has Menace, and Harvester of Miseries is honestly a pretty fringe card. We've seen it show up as like a one-of or a sideboard card in fringe situations, but it's definitely not a standard staple. So on one hand, I feel like if Harvester of Miseries isn't a standard staple, probably unlikely that Zenos is going to be a standard staple. On the other hand, even in Standard, where you can't win the game from someone losing the game, an 8/8 flyer is a legit big body. Like, I don't have a perfect comparison for this, but we got a lot of big dragons. I would say an 8/8 flyer is probably at least like 8 mana in Standard. So if you can play Zenos and then immediately kill the creature that you choose to flip it around into an 8/8, maybe that's enough to make this card good on its own. You like play this, wrath away the small creatures, and then use a go for the throat or whatever, a cut down or something on the creature that's left over, and then just try to beat your opponent down with his 8/8 flying dragon. So maybe it's going to be good enough on that end, but really, I think this is supposed to be a Commander card. And in Commander, it's kind of a cool build around. I think the way I would probably build around this card in Commander is focus on flipping it, which seems pretty easy. Like, to flip it, all you need is some removal. So you play this, choose the thing, kill the thing, flip it around, and then try to build your deck in a way where you're really good at killing one person, trusting that if you can kill that one person, Shinryu is going to actually just give you the win. So maybe maybe you go like Fateful Handoff and try to give your opponent, I don't know, a Mortal Coil or something. Maybe you're doing Demonic Pact shenanigans. Maybe it's Triskaidekaphobia. It's a really cool you lose the game commander, because it turns you lose the game, which only deals with, 1/3 of your opponent's commander game, into a you win the game card, which is just something we haven't really seen before. So Zenos, I feel like in Standard, could be a funny, against odds build around. I think it's probably not quite a top tier card, just because, like I said, if Harvester of Mysteries isn't good enough, I'm not sure flipping into an 8/8 is going to be enough to turn it into a staple, but it seems really cool in Commander, and I do love that this is one of the double face cards that actually flips for free. You gotta put some work into it, but I think it's much more realistic to flip a Zenos in Standard than it is to flip a lot of the other cards where it's pay 8 mana at sorcery speed. That's just such a big ask. But cast a Go for the Throw on the creature that you choose, that's very doable. So I think out of all the double face cards we've seen so far, this might be one of the ones we're most likely to actually see flip around in Standard. But that said, I don't know if it's really good enough to be a top tier Standard card. So yesterday, we talked about Traveling Chocobo, but we didn't really get into the full details of this card because we just had so many cards to talk about. But Traveling Chocobo, the card itself, you probably remember what it does. It's a 3-mana 3/2 bird that lets you look at the top card of your library, play lands and cast birds from the top of your library, and then if a land or a bird entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, you double trigger it. So it's like a Panharmonicon for birds and lands. So we already talked about what the card does, but the interesting thing that we didn't get into is there's actually a whole bunch of Traveling Chocobos. So if you remember, when we went to Lost Caverns of Ixalan, one of the gimmicks of that set is they reprinted Mana Crypt, but they had a bunch of different colored versions. And if you got a collector booster box, you could get the yellow Mana Crypt or the green Mana Crypt, and each had different rarity where some were scarcer than others. So the scarcest one is $3,000, the cheapest one's $200. So they're essentially doing the same thing with Traveling Chocobo. There's a bunch of different colored versions leading up to the textless Golden Chocobo, which is our one serialized card from the set. It is numbered to 77. I think because of Final Fantasy 7, they said. But worth keeping in mind, if you crack a collector booster box, these are probably going to be some of the Chases cards in the set. Obviously, the Traveling Chocobo serialized is going to be the most expensive card in the set. But if you're a box cracker, these are going to be some of the cards you're looking for most in your Final Fantasy collector booster box. Sadly, cannot get them in play boosters. You can get the normal base version in play boosters, but you're going to have to go collector boosters if you want a chance at some of these super shiny, multicolored Chocobos. Finally today, in the world of lower rarity cards, got a few that are worth shouting out, starting with Town Greeter. So Town Greeter, 2 mana for 1/1. When it enters, you mill 4 cards, then you put a land card from among them into your hand, and if you put a town card into your hand this way, you gain 2 life. So Town Greeter, it is essentially exactly Satyr Wayfinder, and I know Satyr Wayfinder doesn't look like much, but good lord, if I played a lot of Satyr Wayfinder decks. It's one of those nuts and bolts cards that just kind of holds decks together if you need to fill your graveyard, and it makes sure you hit your land drop. So I'm actually very excited to see Town Greeter coming back. I guess technically it's a strict upgrade because you could hit a town and gain 2 life. That synergy doesn't actually seem relevant, but worth keeping in mind right now in Standard, we have Onoic Wayfinder and Blatchwood Prowler, but these have proven to just not quite be good enough. They only go 3 cards deep rather than 4 cards deep, which increases your odds of whiffing. It doesn't fill your graveyard as quickly. So I think that the upgrade from these cards to Town Greeter is actually pretty meaningful, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see some Town Greeter decks emerge in Standard, because Satyr Wayfinder has seen play pretty much every time it's been in Standard in the past, and this is quite literally the return of Satyr Wayfinder with a more relevant creature type and a little bit of town upside. We also got a new uncommon saga creature, which I think could be pretty good in Summon Fenrir. So Summon Fenrir, 3 mana for a 3/2 Saga Wolf. First lore counter, search a library for a basic land card, put in a play tapped and shuffle. So essentially 3 mana ramp is the baseline on the card. Next lore counter, when you cast your next creature spell this turn, enters with an additional +1/+1 counter, so a little creature buffing. And then last lore counter, draw a card if you control the creature with the greatest power or tied for the greatest greatest power. If you actually hit all 3 of these modes, this is a very powerful ramp spell, even though it's a temporary creature as a saga creature. But this can be 3 mana, get a basic land, put a counter on something, and draw a card. That is a huge amount of value for a 3 mana ramp spell. So as far as Standard is concerned, I don't think this is our best ramp spell in Standard, but it does take advantage of the fact that the baseline for ramping in Standard is already 3 mana, so you're not really paying any tax. I would say Overlord of the Hauntwoods, still far and away the best 3 mana ramp spell. That card's just kind of insane, especially with Up the Beanstalk. And then Lumbering Worldwagon, I also think is very good. I think Summon Fenrir is somewhere in the Lumbering Worldwagon tier. I think it's clearly above the next group of cards, which is like Return from the Wilds, Roamer's Routine, Scout the Wilderness. Summon Fenrir are definitely better than those. I think that being like maybe the 2nd or 3rd best ramp spell in the format, I think that is enough that this card could be relevant in the right deck, especially have some enchantment synergies, maybe some saga synergies. Then this goes even more up in value. But because ramping at 3 mana is really the going rate in Standard, I think this card is good enough to see Standard play. On the other hand, in Commander, I think this is a specific deck card. So in Commander, the big issue with this card is 3 mana ramp just isn't as appealing because there's a lot of 2 mana ramp in Standard. When you have Rampant Growth and Nature's Lore and 3 Visits and Farseek and Secure Tribe Elder, ramping for 2, ramping for 3 just isn't nearly as exciting. However, it is an enchantment, which is pretty intriguing. If you're playing an enchantment deck, then I think this card can be worth playing. So let's say you're playing Sethis or something. Yes, you could just play Nature's Lore and ramp for 2 mana, but I think it's worth it to pay 1 extra mana to have an enchantment that ramps, because then you're still ramping, but then you're drawing a card with Sethis, or maybe you're Tom Bombadil, you're getting your enchantment synergies. Plus, we have a bunch of new enchantment-based commanders coming in the Final Fantasy set, like Terra and Yuna, so it seems really good there as well. So Summon Fenrir, nothing groundbreaking. It's a 3 mana ramp spell, but to me this looks like a very good and potentially very playable 3 mana ramp spell in Standard and in enchantment-based or saga-based commander decks. We also got about 1 million different versions of Cid Timeless Artificer. So Cid, it's a 4 mana 4/4 legendary human artificer. Says artifact creatures and heroes you control get +1/+1 for each artificer you control and each artificer in your graveyard. You can cycle it for 2 mana, and a deck can have any number of cards named Cid Timeless Artificer. So all these are the exact same card. They just have different art. It seems like, I don't know Final Fantasy, so I don't know who Cid is. I imagine if you're a Final Fantasy plan, you're probably yelling at the screen right now, and it's super obvious to you. But it seems like it's showing off this character through every version of Final Fantasy. I think the most interesting part of this card is a Magic card. It's a new you can play any number of card, but it's legendary. We've never seen a card that you can play any number of that is also a legend, because what this means in practice is even though you can play any number of these in your deck, you can only ever have one on the battlefield because of the legend rule. So I think building around Cid is actually going to be a very unique challenge, because you're going to want to play a ton of these cards, but you got to somehow build around the legend rule, which I guess is going to be just milling them and cycling them in the graveyard and then playing other stuff, artifact creatures and heroes, to get really big based on the number of Cids that you have in your graveyard. So it's going to be interesting to see how this shakes out. I feel like this is Wizards essentially running back Nazguls. Nazguls were really popular in Lord of the Rings set. They had a bunch of different artwork for them. They ended up being chased like $10 uncommons. And I imagine Cid is probably going to be the same. So if you're cracking some boosters, keep an eye out for Cid. It's probably going to be way more expensive than it should be as an uncommon that you can play any number of. Also going to be interesting to see if certain arts are more valuable than others. We saw that with Nazguls, where all the Nazguls were roughly the same price, but then some of them based on the art were a little bit more expensive than the rest. We might see the same things with Cid as well. So Cid, definitely a neat card, gonna be an interesting deck building challenge. As a commander deck in Standard, probably a funny against the odds episode, although it seems a little hard to make a competitive Standard deck around Cid. We also got all the basic lands from the Final Fantasy set, and some of them look pretty spectacular. I especially like the plains. There's also a waste in there for some reason, which, not sure why there's a waste. I guess Wizards just wanted to have a waste with Final Fantasy art, and this was their chance to do it. So keep an eye out for these in your booster packs. And then, of course, a little bit of draft chaff that you can check out over at MTGPreviews.com. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Final Fantasy spoilers for today. So we've reached day 2 of what is going to be a long spoiler season. We got like 2.5 weeks to go still, but let me know what you think of these cards. I gotta say, now that I've actually had a little bit of time to soak in this set, I really like it. As someone who doesn't really play Final Fantasy, to me, all these cards feel pretty magic-y. Like, yes, I know there's some iconic characters or whatever, but flavor-wise, I feel like Final Fantasy fits really well in Magic. Like, if this was a Magic set, I would believe it. Like, yeah, it'd be kind of a far out Magic set, but it feels very Magic-y to me. The designs are really cool. There's a lot of unique stuff going on. And one of the things I hadn't really thought through, but I really love about having a Universes Beyond set in Standard, is in a lot of ways, this kind of feels like a Time Spiral style set or a Modern Horizon style set where we just have so many different like one-off mechanics coming in. It's all these top-down designs trying to show off the characters, and it leads to some really, really cool designs that I'm not sure would ever exist in Magic if it wasn't for the fact that Wizards was trying to recreate their favorite Final Fantasy characters. So far, I really love where this set is heading, but let me know what you think about it in the comments, and I'll be back tomorrow with even more Final Fantasy spoilers. So until then, have a lovely day, everyone, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more Magic? We can find yesterday's spoiler video here, or maybe check out the Mucha Brew, where we tried to find out just how many dragon tokens we could make in Standard.